So like I said, here I am, reviewing my first episode, Caretaker, the pilot, right? Something I want to discuss really right off the bat. I probably should have mentioned this in the series review, but to be completely honest, I forgot, and also I mentioned it in the notes for the episode rather than in the series. But this is truly an issue with the series as a whole. This has been better explained by other individuals, so forgive me for my layman's terms here. Captain Sisko, over on Deep Space Nine, for those of you who have watched the series, was always written to be the captain, the commander actually first, but then later on the captain, right? Why is that relevant? Because he was played by Avery Brooks, who was a gentleman of different colored skin, right? Now, why is that relevant? Because they didn't write him as the Black Captain. They wrote him as the captain, or the commander. You get my point, right? That's very important, because while it was still a part of his character, it was never overemphasized, and there was never any, we have to... The writers never felt the need to compensate for the fact that he wasn't a white male. He was someone that we respected and enjoyed as a character, and he had plenty of potential as himself. And it's worth noting that Avery Brooks is an amazing actor, so that helped. However, an interesting thing to point out here is the fact that Kate Mulgrew is also a pretty good actress, all things considered, and a theatrical actress to some extent. So why is it they felt the need for this? Because there was this horribly sexist opinion that people would not be capable of accepting a female captain. Now that's just mind-blowing to me. Let's keep in mind, first of all, the fact that we've had female captains in the history of the show, in Star Trek, more than once. Let's also ignore the fact that one of the big themes of Star Trek has always been the concept of equality and the idealism thereof, right? Let's also ignore the fact that Kate Mulgrew has a sufficiently commanding presence to present the air of the captain without the writers needing to hold her damned hand the whole way through. I'm sorry if I sound a little angry about this, but this is the source of a lot of grief within Voyager, is the fact that they keep overcompensating when it comes to Janeway. And the reason she's always right, and the reason no one questions her decision, and the reason, within the first episode, the Maki, who is a guerrilla, a leader of a guerrilla army, and specifically left Starfleet on strong moral convictions, says she's the captain. Because nobody could be questioning her in order to get across the point that the viewers were like, okay, so that the viewers would go with it, right? Huge disservice, not just to the series, but to the character, and indeed to Kate Mulgrew, who, if she had been allowed to play the captain rather than the female captain, I think it would have been a lot better. Now, I'll get off my soapbox now. It's just something that's been bugging me for a long time. Each Star Trek series has had a unique pilot, and in some cases two pilots. Speaking of the original series, whoa. Excuse me. Pardon me. Yes, I've upgraded a bit. Each Star Trek series, thus far, has had a pilot that has generally been considered indicative, I guess is the word. Now, that is actually true in the Voyager's case, but it's not really a good thing. Now, let me go into this for a little bit, shall we? The Cage was actually not really a bad episode. It had its upsides, it had its downsides, and overall it did introduce the concept of Star Trek at least moderately well. The Where No Man Has Gone Before did so even better, in my opinion. It showed Kirk being... It gave us hints of who Kirk was, who Spock was, of how the series was going to unfold, right? It wasn't that big, it wasn't that epic, but it didn't have to be. It got the point across. The Next Generation, honestly, Encounter at Farpoint was not that good of an episode. It had kind of a threadbare B or A plot, or whatever you want to call it. But, and this is important, The Next Generation, with the Encounter at Farpoint, introduced Q, and basically began a plot arc that didn't end until All Good Things, actually. The book ends between Encounter at Farpoint and All Good Things, all things considered, especially when you look back, really worked rather well and did introduce the series to some extent or another. Now, unfortunately, They did have some rather serious problems with that, but let's move on from that. Deep Space Nine had, in my opinion, the strongest of the various pilots. Very efficient story, very impacting story. Started off a lot of plot arcs right off the bat there. Kira was introduced in the way she would be growing. Nog was introduced in the first episode, my goodness. Quark was there, and his character arc was started off. That's technically two. I just mentioned Nog because it always amuses me thinking of Nog, an in-depth and amazing character, being the little thief running around, we got to see the way that Dax would be for most of the series, for that matter. We got to see Cisco in action, the little, well, let's just say that he's a little bit more down and dirty than most Starfleet commanding officers, and that's kind of the point. And so forth and so on. It also started major plot arcs. I suddenly can't think of his name. Dukat. It's our first time we see Dukat. It's the first time we're introduced to Dukat. And it starts off the Prophets and the Wormhole. And the Wormhole, of course, by definition, leads to the Dominion, which became the plot arc for the series. All of that was introduced right there in the pilot. Very, very excellent demonstration of it, and it managed to get across the ensemble cast in a way that ultimately did work to the series' benefit. That was an amazing pilot, and frankly, it needed to be because that series was already in trouble right out the gate. Nevertheless, very awesome, right? Why do I say all this? Why do I go over these? Because Voyager's pilot, other than the fact that they get dragged to the Delta Quadrant, and even including that, really, feels like just another episode of Star Trek. Just another episode of TNG, actually. And there's reasons for that, and I've already discussed that, the same team problem. But Caretaker just feels like another episode. There's nothing epic about it. There's nothing interesting about it. The arcs they try to set up don't actually go anywhere. The only character development that happens within Caretaker, I'll discuss in detail later, but the character establishment. Because, for example, several things that they just kind of abandon from Caretaker is the big animosity between Chakotay and Paris is an excellent example. That literally vanishes, just goes away, never comes back, never is even mentioned again, despite the whole, I saved your life, I own you thing. No, it's gone. We do see a bit of the Doctor and how that arc is going to start, and I'll talk about that later, and so forth and so on. But overall, it just felt like a generic episode. And if you changed the ending to they technobabble their way home, you would have a standard episode of TNG, wouldn't you? And it really feels that way, and it really, ironically, does introduce us to Voyager in many more ways than one. But let's talk about this episode, shall we? I want to stress again the potential thing, as I'll discuss more in detail when I get to my changes list, which is this gigantic section over here for the first episode. There was a lot of potential on display, even in Caretaker. Ignoring the premise for a moment, even within this specific episode, there was a great deal of possibility that was just sitting there singing on the side, saying, "Now over here to the potential, it's magnificent." Let's talk about the Maki. This was one of the true amazing ideas that Star Trek had that flopped horribly in its execution. They introduced the Maki way back in season 4, I believe, of Star Trek Next Generation, and they introduced them in their... Wait, no, I'm sorry. They laid the groundwork. I apologize. They laid the groundwork for the Bajorans in that issue back in TNG. Then they introduced the Maki in DS9 and their formation, and then they were also present in TNG. The reason for this was because they wanted to have the regulars who watched both shows, or indeed one of the shows, to know who and what the Maki are, so that we can get across who and what they are without having to bog down the viewers with a lot of exposition, because it was supposed to be an important plot point, that the Maki and the Voyager crew were going to be joining forces in the Delta Quadrant. All of that sounds great. All of that worked great. But as many other people have commented on, and I have to add my voice into it, the fact that the Maki crew with the exception of like 5 times throughout the series, one of which was joking and on a holodeck, completely assimilate into the Voyager crew and just suddenly turn into Starfleet officers rather than being Maki is a little bit ridiculous. And I do wish they had lived up to the potential of having the differing perspectives, which I'll talk about more later. Let's see here. Then we've got... there's the Paris and Chakotay thing. Duh. Let's talk about Harry Kim really quick. Harry Kim, according to Garrett Wong, he was actually directed to act woodenly. And I actually believe him, especially the way he presents his acting in so many episodes. It's very rare that Harry Kim gets to do anything meaningful. There are actually several Harry Kim episodes, but most of them involve him dying in some way or another. And several of them involve him desperately trying to get back to the ship. But he never actually grows, and we never actually see anything about him in those episodes, and that's important. He did not actually have anything approaching character growth until the episode where he walked up one day and said, "Hey, I have character growth." So, that being said, I'm still inclined to be generous towards Harry Kim, especially whenever he does show himself as what he's supposed to be. The ensign fresh out of the academy, who is very smart, who is very good at science and technology, and can use that potential in this hostile situation out in the Delta Quadrant where they need that kind of expert, even though he's fresh out of the academy. So he's flawed, in other words, but he still has something to offer to the crew, and indeed the show, as a means of entertainment. And you see that on display in several cases in Caretaker. His entire interaction with Quark is frankly awesome. That may also be because Quark is involved. But there are several scenes he has. I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead on my list a little bit. The interactions between him and Taurus I actually liked quite a bit. I thought teaming up B'Elanna Torres, who is a former Starfleet, and we find this out very quickly in Caretaker. She's a former Starfleet who is part Klingon and so has anger issues already, is part of the Maki and so is used to doing things her own way. Very rough around the edges, right? Pairing that up with the completely green ensign straight from the academy, who has his own prejudices that he has to overcome, and indeed a deal of disdain that he shows early on for her because she's a Maquis. Throwing those two characters into the mix actually, I think, worked very well and was one of the higher points of the episode, was those two's interaction. It is a shame, I must point out, that the big medical drama about the illness they have is literally forgotten the moment they're rescued. Yes, we can assume that the doctor cures it, but I mean literally forgotten. It's like, oh my god, we're gonna die, and everyone dies of this illness, and then they get rescued, and then it's literally never mentioned again. Little bit of a dropping the ball there, guys. However, again, I'm trying not to geek out too much and go into the details too much. Let's go ahead and be fair. Those were decent scenes, and I did enjoy their interactions with one another. But I wanted to talk about Harry, especially in leading up to Tom Paris. Now, Tom Paris is, without question, my second favorite character on the show, and I admit that freely. Pardon me. I'm gonna have to take a lozenge after this. Tom Paris is a generally good guy who is very. He had a rough way through life, but he always ended up trying to make it better and ended up getting screwed over as a result of that. And so that tends to hang on him. One of the things I made note of here is the fact that he womanizes in several occasions. Now, it's noteworthy that that is not a caricature. He never reaches the point where he is only a womanizer, where that's his defining character trait, is that he's into girls, right? Every time he does it, with the exception of the B'Elanna arc later on, and Cass, with those two exceptions, and possibly a couple others I don't think of right now. Let's just stick with Caretaker, okay? In Caretaker, the one time, well, two times, he does the womanizing thing. It is very clear and very apparent by the way he's presenting himself that that is a form of a mask. That's a form of him hiding. And McNeil pulls off the subtlety of that surprisingly well. It's one of the rare moments of subtlety because, as I'll mention later, I'll go ahead and talk about it now. One of Voyager's problems, and Caretaker has this problem especially. Voyager has the difficulty of, rather than showing you something, they'll say something and then they'll outline it in detail and really just to drive it home. There's always that feeling there that the writers think that the viewers are just idiots. And I don't care for that. That being said, I do cherish the moments of genuine subtlety of performance and of presentation. And again, Tom Paris is one of those examples. Like I said, the mask of the womanizing, but on top of that, his friendship with Harry does actually generate very, very quickly, but it does so in such a way that it seems completely natural to me. Harry being someone who is completely inexperienced and nevertheless is freshly in the mindset of the ideal of the Federation and of Starfleet, which is acceptance and tolerance and friendship, right? At least on paper. But nevertheless, Harry does aspire to that ideal on paper. And Tom Paris is someone who does genuinely care about other people, who is, like I said, a good person at heart, in my interpretation, of course. Takes Harry under his wing pretty much immediately because he sees very quickly that Harry needs someone to take him under his wing. And so he just kind of moves into that role without really meaning to. And in return, Harry helps Tom realize who Tom Paris is. We start to see who Tom Paris is. Or rather, Tom starts to see who Tom Paris is because his interactions with Harry help him to open up just a little bit. And we do see this in Caretaker, so props. On top of that, anytime he talks about his past, anytime he talks about the things he did, there is caked layers of bitterness in his performance, and you could see that he is just so ground down in his own mind. You could just tell that he has been telling himself for years, that I was an idiot and the biggest mistake I ever made, all that stuff. But you can tell it's just talk because some part of him somewhere thinks, I don't regret what I did. And I enjoy that. I enjoy McNeil's performance of Tom Paris. For those who don't know, Tom Paris is extremely heavily based on a character whose name I can't remember from the first Duty in The Next Generation, played by Robert McNeil. There are some minor variations between the two, but it is extremely obvious, as with the Lorerunner thing over in Deep Space Nine, that the role was originally intended to be for that character, and they didn't want to deal with the legal hassles and issues that would engender, and I don't blame them. So they didn't. But let's go ahead and move on here. I want to go ahead and mention this here. One of the problems Voyager tends to have, and this is true in Caretaker as well, is they tend to go for what I was just talking about in Final Fantasy X, weird for weird's sake, right? This is especially true with a gentleman named Brandon Braga, who anybody who has genuinely watched Voyager and is well aware of that crowd within my viewers know exactly who Brandon Braga is. I will do my best not to bash him as hard as I can, but it is true to say that one of the things that he enjoys as a tool in his writing arsenal is the mind game, the head game, the getting in there and doing odd things and weird things that are just there to weird you out. 90% of the time, they don't actually service the story or the plot, and this is true in Caretaker. This is why I disliked it. It is weird for weird's sake. It doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't actually accomplish anything. In this case, it's the yokels and the rural setting. Speaking as someone who lives in a place that I consider to be rural, because, I'm from California. I'm not actually from here. But, to see them go into that whole, oh no, and I got deviled eggs, and there's a banjo player down, let's go ahead and dance. I'm sorry, but that whole scene had no purpose or point. It literally existed as padding. They could have supplanted that with a literal waiting room. Picture the dramatic potential, if you will. This is technically skipping ahead into my changes thing, but picture this, if you will. That instead of in this little rural yokel, hey, what's going on? I got lemonade and sugar cookies setting. Imagine a white room, a cube. Okay? There's no features, there's no doors, there's no nothing. Now imagine the crew being in this room, trying to figure out what's going on, using the tricorders, can't figure it out. And then we do a bit of a cutscene, and I'm sorry, not a cutscene, a cut pass. I can't think what that's called all of a sudden. Let's call it a crossfade, because that's the effect name, into the same area in a scene to show the fact that time has passed. And we find out that they're still just sitting there, and several of the crew members are starting to get anxious, and several of the people are starting to have issues. And, especially given the fact that we have amongst this crew Tom Paris and Harry Kim, it would not be infeasible to see them start to wig out a little bit, and their antics, smashing on the walls or trying to use their phasers or something like that, causes the Caretaker to then be like, okay, well, I wasn't ready for you yet, but we'll just have to proceed ahead of schedule. And imagine how much more intimidating and frankly creepy that scene would have been if it had done with that aura of menace about it, rather than the barn and the people holding pitchforks for no reason, and people running around with tricorders. Picture that, if you will. Now, since that's a negative, let's go ahead and follow this with a positive. The Doctor. The Doctor has very few scenes in Caretaker, but every single one of them is awesome, and he completely steals the scene in just about every one he's in. We also see the beginning of the Doctor's arc right here, and this is a good thing. I was talking about this earlier. They actually start the Doctor's character arc, one of the longest-standing arcs throughout the series of Voyager, right here, slap bang in the first episode. And it's done in a subtle way, which is what I love. We find out, we get the info dump very quickly, right? We are introduced to the chief medical officer. Chief medical officer dies. Nurse dies. Okay, we're with that. That's sad. He was kind of a jerk, though, so we don't mind that much, because this is Star Trek. I mean, come on. People die all the time, right? And these people die. The emergency medical hologram is pulled into action, and we know from the way he is presented that, Harry Kim walks in and says, activate the EMH, right there, boom. We know from the way he does it, he's not like, activate the, what's it called? Activate the EM, the emergency medical hologram. He doesn't deliberate about it. He doesn't have to think about it. This is something he knows just like that, and so we, the audience, are immediately on board with this information because this is the norm for them. You with me? On top of that is the fact that as soon as he is put on, he is a little bit on the cantankerous side, which sets up several other aspects of his arc. But more importantly, he is treated like a tool, like a tricorder, like a hypospray. There's actually two scenes in particular I want to point out. One is where he is, quite correctly, trying to take care of his patient and shoo away the people who are bothering his patient, and he gets turned off. And he actually has this beautiful expression as he's turned off, as she says, deactivate the EMH, and his eyes go wide just a little bit. Not only just with shock, but with a little bit of outrage, like, what? Excuse me? And then he's off. Excellent scene. The subtlety of it was there. Like I was talking about in my Voyager in general review. There is subtlety. There is enjoyable moments within the performances of the actors. And another one, which is actually before that, is when he's when Tom, I had to think about the character, I apologize. When Tom is dealing with other problems and his mind is on Harry, and the EMH is like, oh my god, help me. You have to tell me what's going on, to explain, at least someone turn me off. Tom completely and utterly ignores him, which sets up the way that the crew tends to present themselves towards him, and that is one of his major character arcs. And I'll go into that in more detail later, but I like the fact that they started it bang on right at the start. Now, let's talk about something that's ridiculous. I was talking about ridiculous things earlier. I'm going to use a bit of an example here. An episode in Battlestar Galactica, whose name I suddenly can't think of. It was one of the very earliest episodes, in the remake, by the way, in the new one. Had water as a primary plot point, okay? Now, if someone comes to you in a science fiction show and says, okay, we need water to be a plot point, you have to really think about that to make that work. You really have to be creative and be innovative in order to make that work, because it's water. I'm sorry, but anyone with the technology to travel through space probably has the ability to synthesize hydrogen and oxygen to some degree or another, or at least go find it, right? However, Battlestar Galactica did rather successfully, given the circumstances, given the setup, and given the payoff, manage to make water a successful plot point. They were intelligent about it. Voyager was not. Voyager was very not. And it's worth noting that even Voyager acknowledges this, because the water plotline is literally dropped in Caretaker. Oh my god, we have water, and we will get water, and I want this technology that creates water, and they will steal the Ocampa's water. And that's the last we hear of it. Right there. Bam. Never heard from again. And good riddance, if I might say so. The Kazon were a bit of a mistake to begin with, but making water be a valuable resource in the way they did it, the way they executed it, the way they performed it, no, didn't work. And there's the Harry and Taurus thing I wanted to mention. And there's the needless exposition thing I mentioned, because there's a scene right after that where the pulses are increasing, that the Caretaker is sending energy to the Ocampa, rather than just have it slowly increase in the background until suddenly both characters stop and are like, and they wouldn't have to say anything. They're listening as the pulses are, and then the pulses stop, and then they would twitch again and be like, and then they would look at each other and said, now what, or something like that, right? Instead, what happens in the actual episode is the pulses start to increase, and then Taurus says, do you hear that? And Harry says, yeah, the pulses are increasing, because the audience is too stupid to hear the fact that the pulses are increasing. I may have been paraphrasing a bit there. And then Taurus, and then they stop, and then Taurus says, they stopped, because the audience is too stupid to hear the fact that they stopped. You know what I mean? Again, it's one of those scenes where they were like, no. Just too much needless exposition. You guys don't have to lay everything out for us. We're not retarded. I swear, honest, we're not. We have brains. They're up here. All right, moving on. Now that's actually it for discussion about the episode overall. Overall, I'm not going to do ratings. I'm not going to do what Sci-Fi Debris does, but I did enjoy Caretaker to an extent, and it did interest me in the series just enough to keep me watching when it actually came out originally. Nowadays, it is not an episode I enjoy rewatching, but part of that, I will admit, part of the changes probably have to do with the changeover from pardon me, from pilot to series proper. Now, that being said, there's two other things I want to discuss really briefly here. You notice I haven't mentioned Neelix at all, and that's because I'll mostly mention Neelix in my changes section. Kes, I think, was probably one of the strongest characters in this, alongside Tom Paris and indeed the Doctor with his, 3 scenes. Most of Kessa's scenes were very well done, and you could see there was a genuine passion behind her performance when she talks about, I can't believe our caretaker wouldn't want us to open our eyes and see the sunlight. Things like that. That's a bit of a misquote, but you get the point. Really got across the character without saying it. This is beautiful, because this is what a show should do. In the exact opposite example of what I just mentioned, we get to see Kess's character without her saying, I am Kess, and I am an exploratory, and blah, blah, blah manner. It was not needless expedition. It wasn't treating us like we were idiots. She demonstrated what kind of character she was by her actions and by the way she presented herself to the other Ocampa and to the Starfleet personnel. And I thought that worked really well. I definitely put down Kess as a character, and the actress who played her, Jerry Ryan, I believe was her name. I could be wrong about that. I don't remember her name. I'm not very good at that. As a bonus, as a good, as a benefit to the overall episode. I'm sorry, I gotta know her damn name now. Jennifer Lean. I was totally wrong. Or is that Line? I'm not actually sure, but let's just call her Jennifer. She does a good job of the role, and she is one of the highlights of the original few episodes there. Now, the other thing I want to talk about is the Ocampa. This is going to segue into my changes section. What I would change. The Ocampa. I'm not even going to go into the specifics, but like I said in my previous review, you kind of have to go with a few things, and you kind of have to rein the geek in, and you kind of have to not expect everything to fit in order to enjoy a lot of this stuff in Star Trek. But the Ocampa, a species that lives for single-digit years and only mates once. And you know what? I'm going to stop there. There are a lot of ridiculous facts we learn about the Ocampa in Elogium, which I'll cover when we get to Elogium. But here, right off the bat, we know they mate once. Actually, I don't think they mentioned that in Caretaker. I apologize. Nevertheless, they have single-digit lifelines, and we do find out later they mate once, ever. And there's a bunch of other absolutely ridiculous facets to their species. Oh, and they're partially telekinetic from previous generations that was wiped out by their dependency on the Caretaker. Now, that last part is practically ignored in its entirety in favor of the first two, for the most part, when it comes with regards to the Ocampa. And it's also worth noting that in Caretaker, the Ocampa problem is never solved. Janeway gives lip service to the Ocampa will eventually have to leave and learn on their own, rather than actually trying to do anything to help them, even though her reasoning she gave for destroying the array was to help the Ocampa. So why doesn't she then help the Ocampa? But I'm getting off track a little bit here. The Ocampa were a stupid idea. You could have done a race of elves, or of telekinetic creatures, very easily without making them ludicrous. Let's just look at the base facts that I just gave you. 9-year lifespan, or 8-year, whatever it is. Mates once, okay? Can you do math? Basic math? I'm sorry, I'm sounding a little bit derisive here, but honestly, that species will genocide itself into simple stagnation of the gene pool and non-existence without anyone else's interference within, someone actually did the math, but a certain number of generations. It's not going to last. Guys, really? But let's leave the Ocampa out of this, because let's talk about changes. Now, I have a list of changes here. I'm going to try and remember how I did this as much, because I really just put little notes here. First change, Neelix in his entirety. No, in all honesty, Neelix represented, as usual, a great deal of potential. We have a crew that consists of Starfleet personnel and a crew that consists of Maki personnel. Now, in theory, we have two very differing perspectives on people who, until yesterday, basically, were enemies, and indeed were actively being pursued by or pursuing the other, right? So we've already got some dynamic going on there. Now, these people don't have to necessarily be actively hostile to each other for it to be an engaging tension and drama dynamic between the two parties. However, getting back to Neelix, if Neelix had been made into a more Han Solo type character, someone who is a genuinely good person at his heart, but nevertheless has been existing more or less on the fringe, for lack of a better term, having to live with less than what he has, having to deal with less than what he has, having or what he wants rather. You know, he obviously cares about Kes, for example, but the implication is there and never explored about the fact that Neelix could have been trying for however long in order to rescue Kes and simply never got the opportunity because his means were so limited. Thus, the Voyager crew would be such a boon to him. I think Neelix could have been presented as that. You didn't even have to change the fact that he lied about the rescue attempt. However, immediately after doing so, a very needed scene was Neelix immediately turning to Janeway and apologizing, saying, "I'm very sorry. I had no reason to trust you people. I could not lose this opportunity to save Kes. I had to. I'm sorry. I will accept whatever punishment you deem necessary," and blah, 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 and then they could work things out. And throughout the course of the series, and again, this is why I have to try and limit myself to just this episode, but Neelix could have been that kind of a character, the scoundrel, who is nevertheless a good person, but A, native to the area, so he has a third perspective on things, B, grounded by Kes, who is actually a fourth perspective on things, with her naivety and her general innocence, and I wouldn't change Kes at all, by the way, I really wouldn't. She was awesome. I like how they presented her in this episode. We'll talk about other things later. But her general naivete, her innocence, and her lightheartedness would have been a nice counterbalance to his general scruffiness, his I keep mentioning Han here, really, in the way he presents himself, because he's been through so much. Let's not forget that later on we find out Neelix went through a war, and discovered that he was so much of a coward that he couldn't fight in that war. I wouldn't actually change that fact in my vision of Neelix, because I think that's a powerful moment for the character and really defines where he went after that, and why it is he's on the fringe, and why it is he has been on the less than legal side of things ever since, because he could not bring himself to support that sort of environment that produced the war that happened, right? Makes sense? So that's what I would have done with Neelix. The Ocampa new dilemma. What was that? Oh, so the whole concept of the caretaker wanting to procreate, I would have changed that completely. I would have. Let's go ahead and, for the sake of argument, keep the Ocampa at a. Let's go ahead and extend their lifelines a bit, because 9 years is a bit silly. But let's keep the fact that they only mate once. Let's say because of the severe stagnation that the caretaker has more or less forced upon them in its attempt to make up for the fact that it already screwed up their world. So in other words, if you're keeping track, it has now messed with them twice, both in a bad way. The caretaker realizes the truth of what he has done to them after some time, obviously, because he's not the brightest of individuals, pardon me. And they can only mate once. That's important. That's the big thing, right? And the caretaker becomes aware of this and begins searching the galaxy for different beings to find something with the genetic diversity or the DNA or whatever technobabble you want to throw in there, but something to help liven up the variations in the genetic gene in the gene pool for the Ocampa in order to produce a species that is still the Ocampa, but that can reproduce more than once in their lifetime, and as such, literally save the species. Therefore, we take this thing that was a weakness and turn it into a strength, turn it into one of the major points of the story, because he is then dying, and this is why he has been so obsessive, why he has been so insistent, why he has been so erratic the last several months, is because he knows he's dying, and now he has to hurry. You know, he's been looking for this solution for some time, but now he's just, oh God, ships, I need everything in the galaxy, you know, and he fails and he fails and he fails, and let's say, for the sake of argument, that he goes ahead and finds something close to a solution by the end there with the Voyager crew or with the Maki crew, one of the two, and thus the Ocampa problem, which in the original Caretaker is completely abandoned by the time the episode is over, then becomes probably the next episode, if I were to be honest, where the crew then deals with the drama of trying to fix that and trying to enact this genetic change upon the Ocampa in the wake of the Caretaker's absence, while at the same time trying to figure out the use of the array in order to get themselves back home and acclimating each to one another and learning how to work together. You could have had a whole episode about that. which is why I try to limit myself to one episode, because if I really had my way, I'd just rewrite Voyager, but let's not get into that. Now, the, how do I put this? The whole... Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next point I have written down here. You know what, actually, let's skip that ahead. We'll leave the Kazon for a little bit later. The array and its usage getting back home. Now, there are many other ways you could have used a plot device in order to keep Voyager in the Delta Quadrant, because it kind of had to, right? The whole series hinged on that idea. However, one of the conceits that we have within the course of Caretaker is that there is a way to use the Caretaker to send everyone home. Now, the Caretaker himself specifically says it would be terribly complicated to send you home. I would change that line. I would change that line to say it is impossible to send you home. And when they challenge that, he explains that the way their technology works is similar to the technology of the... Shoot, I can't think of the species name. There's another species over in TNG, big head guys who use Barclay, make him super intelligent, and then bring the Enterprise to them in order to study them, right? A similar general concept. Now, obviously, they had a way back, so let's ignore that specifically, but my point I'm trying to get across here is that their technology pulls, okay? Even in basic physics, pulling is much easier than pushing, especially since pulling will always, if you're trying to be specific, no matter where you're pulling from, it will always end up at this point because this is the point you're pulling it from. However, if you push it out, it becomes much more difficult to direct it. Even a fraction of a degree in any direction, given the distances we're talking about, could send them just about anywhere. Now, you could say, of course, they would be willing to accept that in order to be 70,000 light years in that general direction. However, I think it would be more interesting to... there's several other ways around this, by the way, but just this time through, watching Caretaker this time, my very first knee-jerk reaction was, why not make it so he can't send them back? The array cannot send them back. Now, they do end up probably destroying the array anyways, to keep it out of the hands of the Kazon. But let's go ahead and start discussing that. The Kazon should have been a one-off villain, not the big threat of the Quadrant. You've made many an enemy today. The Kazon were ridiculous. I'm sorry. The Kazon were never an acceptable threat for the Muppets, let alone a crew of a starship in Starfleet. No. And I'm not even going to go into the details. Anybody who's watched Voyager understands where I'm coming with on this. The Kazon should have been the one-off villain of that episode and not brought back any further. Or if they were going to be brought back further, they need to be changed completely from what they are right now. Because as they are, they're a very cheap and, frankly, degrading knockoff of the Klingons. No. And that's all I'm going to say about the Kazon. They're not worth my time. Janeway and Chakotay. Now, this is an idea I love. I wish I had been the one to come up with this idea, but actually a friend of mine mentioned it, and I believe Sci-Fi Debris had the same idea too. I do apologize. I feel like I'm going to be aping Sci-Fi Debris on several points. But it's not because I'm doing it intentionally, if that makes any sense. I genuinely have these thoughts in my own accord. We just happen to have similar thoughts. Hey, go figure. Imagine how much different the episode would have unfolded if Janeway was a science officer who was assigned as the first officer to the Voyager underneath a captain. Now, keep in mind, the actual first officer in the episode only has something like 5 lines total, and then he dies, right? So what I'm getting at here is switching those around, making Janeway the first officer and making the captain some guy who has 5 lines and then dies would not have been a big deal from a production standpoint. At that point, you have Janeway suddenly thrust into command, into a situation that she was not exactly prepared for. Now, obviously, because she is the first officer, because she's a commander, she has taken the command test, she has qualified for command. So she does take command and she does do her job, but she suddenly finds herself in a position she neither wanted nor expected. Now let's add a dynamic to that. One of the greatest tragedies of Star Trek Voyager is a character named Chakotay. Chakotay was potential incarnate. You look at a description of that character on paper and you think, yes, awesome. I love it. I want to see more. You see him in the series and you see a roll of toilet paper that's just kind of sitting there. It's bland, it's white, and there's nothing interesting about it. And after a few minutes you forget it's there. I really feel for Robert Beltran and the fact that they never gave him what he deserved, if I might be so frank. But leaving aside the series as a whole, just within this episode, imagine the potential if he came on board, a experienced military leader, commander of a guerrilla army, who has very strong moral convictions, is very strong, a grounded sense of what is right and wrong, and a general lack of reverence for Starfleet protocols. Put him on the bridge because Janeway needs him to join with her because her own crew has been damaged and she needs to make this joint crew thing happen, right? So he ends up. She is, of course, the captain, and he defers to that, but without any malicious intent. He projects the leadership in being the captain because he's experienced at that, because he is much more experienced at commanding, at leading, especially in a battle situation, than she is. Someone who, until now, has not actually captained her own ship, whereas he has been in command of several ships in the past, and I'll get into that idea a little bit later. Imagine the potential that would have for the dynamic between those two characters, and imagine, if you will, going past the individual episode for a moment, how amazing it would have been if through the series we find out that the two end up kind of leading jointly. Janeway is the captain, yes, but rather than her being the captain, as we have had in so many instances previously, wouldn't it be amazing if the two of them were both the captain, if you understand what I'm saying here? If they jointly led the Voyager crew, if they were equals, and if the friendships and tension between the two sprung from that. I'm not talking about romantic tension, by the way. Yeah. I'm talking about the fact that the two disagree on many issues because she's Starfleet principles, Starfleet rules and regulations, obviously, and primarily, let's be honest with ourselves, a science officer who command is kind of a secondary thing for her. He is all about the reality of now and the pragmatism of now and what exactly we can do in order to help these people. And both of them are ultimately on the same side, and both of them are ultimately going for the same goal, but they both think so differently that they do this thing. You know what I mean? Imagine how awesome it would be for the series if those two had that dynamic going throughout it. And for the first several episodes, indeed probably I'd say for the first season, I would have the two butting heads in various ways until they slowly grow to realize, inch by inch, episode by episode, that the more they work together, the better things work out. I think that would have been awesome, personally. That's just me, of course. But the other thing I wanted to mention briefly is that the ships, right. It would have made a lot more sense. This is a very minor note, but Chakotay's little ship, which is very little, contained something like 50-ish, I believe, Maki crew in it, including a whole lot of their belongings that just happened to be on that ship. That never made a lot of sense to me. Granted, this is a little thing, but I like little details that are put in there to make things a little bit more believable and to make things, to encourage the viewer to put things together, or at the very least not have to look back and think, that makes no sense. Make it a fleet. Instead of one Maki ship that was fleeing the Cardassian, the Galore cruiser, yes, I know what that ship was called, and have it be a small little fleet. None of them very big ships, and probably that one that did exist being this largest, but little runabouts and those tiny little fighters they had. And that fleet gets hit by the wave, and that's why they take so many losses, and that's why they have so many of their things with them, because this was a small little flotilla. You follow where I'm going with this? A mobile force. So they had all their stuff with them, and they had the personnel with them in order to back up the merging of the crew idea, and the fact that they have all their things with them when they go onto it. Make sense? Let's see here. I have two more notes here. Two very small notes, actually, and then I'll go ahead and stop. This is turning out to be a longer review than I thought, but this is the Caretaker, and I was just talking to one of my roommates who said, if you end up, because I have a tendency to talk for a great deal, because I go into so much detail and I want to analyze so much the things I review, that she was mockingly saying that my reviews are probably going to end up longer than the episodes themselves. So far, I'm not there, yay, but that's only because this is a two-parter, technically, because, it's a pilot. But I want to say my last two pieces here. First of all, there is a very minor note that would have changed. A lot of the dramatic tension is ruined because they have this big crisis on Voyager where the warp core is going to go critical, and they keep cutting away to Ricardo stealing the scene, and right before that, Harry is like, we're in the Delta Quadrant. That's the big reveal, right? Move that, shift that, move that quite a bit later. They're oh my god, they get up. These people are dead. Let's get medical attention going on. Oh god, we've got a warp core breach. Okay, I need to get down to engineering, and nobody's paying attention to the sensors or anything like that. Yes, I know that's a little unrealistic, but the ship is about to blow up. And sometimes realism can go away for the sake of drama, because the flow of it would be much better, in my opinion, if they then dealt with the immediate crisis of the ship blowing up, then dealt with the scenes with Ricardo, then they all get the two kind of merge. Catherine, Janeway successfully saves the ship. They because they lost the chief engineer. The Ricardo has had his scenes and successfully diagnoses everyone. Everyone gets teleported off the array. They have the array scenes, which I would have done completely differently. I was already mentioned. They get back. They find out their crew are missing. They talk to the Maki, and that's when, while they're on the communications with the Maki, Harry says, "Captain, I may be reading these readings wrong, but something better than that. I may be looking at this wrong, but these readings indicate that we're over 70,000 light years from where we started, and that way it's introduced to both crews simultaneously." And in an appropriately dramatic way, and I like that better. I like the flow of that better. But that's just me. And again, it's a minor thing. Next thing, last thing, the whole Paris Chakotay thing. I would have either ejected that entirely, which is, to be honest, my initial thoughts on that matter, or changed it. Why not have it so that their animosity is nowhere near as strong as it was shown in Caretaker, but nevertheless, Chakotay does think that Paris doesn't have a sense of duty or obligation. Obligation, ironically. And Paris thinks that Chakotay is simply too stuck up with his own little moral code that doesn't listen to anything else. And the two are nevertheless belligerent. Now imagine the kind of friendship that could blossom between those two characters, and indeed the friendship that should have blossomed between those two characters, if you really think about it. If you think about Chakotay on paper and the way I would present him, and if you think about Tom Paris, and indeed the way he was presented, those two characters mesh actually quite well. And I think that would have been an excellent move for the show. But anyways, I'm now done. Yay, I've done it. Feel free to tell me comments on how horrible I am in reviewing TV episodes. I will... No, I'm not going to be watching the next episode immediately tonight. I need to rest my throat. But one way or another, I intend to continue this relatively soon. And I'm going to start working on my Final Fantasy X-2 review. So, I will talk to you guys later.